Are you an agent struggling to understand real estate economics? Would you benefit from learning how top agents structure their businesses? Then you've come to the right place. And it's time for the Nerdy Agent Podcast Business Tip of the Week.
Business tip.
Business tip. Such a good intro. We have
Today,
nailed that. Guys.
Today, we are discussing closing gifts and if they are worthwhile, what they can do for you. Tell me about closing gifts, guys.
Closing gifts are a thing that it seems like when you first start in the industry, everyone's like, you got to do a closing gift for every closing, right? And you have to just make sure they get some sort of present to remember you by. It's kind of the thought process. I spent an insane amount of time on closing gifts when I first started because I am very particular about how I gift in general in life. And it kind of got to the point where it actually overwhelmed the heck out of me. But I don't know how you guys feel about it.
Yeah, I mean, it like, especially once you have enough closings happening, it can take a ton of time to pick out your closing gifts. But I know you have a story I think that you could tell. But I can tell a story about my very first closing back in 2014. And my clients were buying a townhome in Carver. While we were pending, Mrs. Buyer's dad died of prostate cancer, and she had told me about that. So I was like, what could I do that would be a thoughtful gift that relates to this? And so I donated $200 to a prostate cancer research deal, and she totally just lost at the closing and thought it was like the nicest, greatest gift ever. And again, you don't give people gifts because it makes you look cool, but it is nice to make someone feel something
100%
when you give them something. So again, I like that approach where you're like, I'm gonna think about what would impact this person's life and make them feel good, and within this greater awesome moment of buying a house. And I think if you have the time and effort, resources, and it doesn't overwhelm you, it's a great way to go about it.
My biggest piece of advice for people is make sure you're thoughtful about what you're giving somebody. I think the biggest trap agents fall into is they believe they have to do this. We bought a house, and not to knock this agent, but this was down in the South, and she gave us a magazine subscription to Southern Living. And I was like, this is fine, but that doesn't give me any feels inside. It doesn't make me feel like you know who I am. You just like, oh, you moved here from somewhere else, so you should have a magazine now. Versus I like to be very thoughtful about, sometimes I don't give closing gifts. And I'll think I helped a guy buy a house. He's a big football fan. And I didn't give him a closing gift, but I'm going to walk over to his house before the next football game and actually drop off a case of beer and a pizza and say hi, right? That's going to go a lot further for that relationship for me than just, giving him a $25 gift card to Home Depot at closing. So that's my biggest piece of advice is how you think about that.
Yeah, I think being thoughtful about it is definitely helpful, especially if it's a situation where you can be thoughtful and you've thought of something up front versus you're spending so much time trying to figure this out and it's overwhelming you, like you said. I do have a little bit different approach because I'm a pretty automated type of person.
And I think that's the thing a lot of agents are, though.
They are.
Hey, here's your movie bucket.
So I thought, how could I be automated and also be semi-thoughtful?
Right.
So I do the, drawing of the house for every single person. But the other thing I did have on here too, even if you were not giving any closing gifts, let's say, I personally believe that champagne, as long as you know they aren't sober or whatever that is an absolute
If you
must.
don't know, it's a little bit of a dangerous game.
Yeah, it can be, but most people wouldn't be that upset about it. I think it's a must, personally, because it's a super exciting thing, and especially for a first-time homebuyer to go home to their house and to have a glass of champagne to celebrate is pretty fun, personally.
I for sure agree with that. And I think, too, one thing that I've thought of as I've been doing this more and more is sometimes it actually makes a lot more sense to give the closing gift after the closing. One thing that I focused on early on that I realized is that the 30 days leading up to the closing and the 30 days after the closing are your best chance to get a referral. So you'll notice that you'll get referrals from people immediately after they close. I just had this happen to me a month ago. And if you can stretch out that time a little bit more by being in front of them with something thoughtful, that can work too. So if your client closes and a month later you're like, well, it's not Vikings season yet, but I know he's a big Vikings fan. I'm going to just text him right before the game at 11:30 and say, hey, are you home? I'm going to drop something off.
Yep.
And you bring it over to him. He's like, wow, that was such a freaking cool gift. And now Josh is in his brain again. And now when he goes back out, talks to his friends, his coworkers, whoever, he's remembering that experience. And that's just elevating it and making it stretch out a little bit longer.
And I think that's a good point is gifting doesn't have to be just a closing gift, right? There are, like I said, closing, and the other component of this is closing gifts are expensive. So if you're spending $50 per client, you're going to add up over the course of the year a decent amount of money. So if you're not going to get any sort of value or return for that gift, think about other ways you can distribute gifting throughout the year. So I have a reminder on my calendar every week actually to send out 3 random gifts is actually my thing. They're like, oh, like for example, one of my clients, I had not met them, but I knew they were having a baby and I knew they were moving from out of town. And so the first time that I met them, I actually went and bought a soda t-shirt because they're moving from out of town to Minnesota, a baby onesie, and I got to their first showing and I handed them a onesie for their baby. And it's like that was a way for me to immediately be memorable. And I went to their house. We've closed now. I just went over last week to check in on them, and they had it up in their closet, and they pulled it out and showed it to me. And they were so excited for her to wear it when they have her in 3 weeks here.
So cool.
How much did it cost you?
$17.
And I think
they love you forever.
Exactly. And the last note I had on here before we wrap up is I also think that agents need to remember that the long-term follow-up, if you're thinking from a business perspective, typically outweighs the closing gift, unless the closing gift is this extraordinary thing that they're never.
If you take them to Turks
forget.
and Caicos, then you're gonna probably have them forever.
Exactly,
Yeah.
but the long-term follow-up is where you're gonna make your money.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
And that's the business tip of the week.
Business tip.
Business tip.